He is believed to have been one of the worst kings ever to rule over England, and King John's reign over his nation was one which was categorised by losses of land and by rebellion. He was the king who was forced to sign the Magna Carta, and he was a man who was suspicious and vengeful. He was a man who had a large knowledge of his country. However, inside of Newark Castle, on the 19th of October 1216, at the age of 49, King John died. He was described as someone who was distasteful and even dangerous, as well as a man who was very cruel. However, over the centuries, the king's coffin, following its burial, was broken into, and what those people saw was incredible. King John, initially it's believed, would never really become king. He was seen as the spare during his father, Henry II's reign. He was his father's favourite son. However, in 1189, his brother Richard succeeded to the throne, becoming Richard I. However, John would later become the heir to his brother's throne. It was in 1199 when John became king and war with France began again, and this was triggered by the second marriage of John. He was asked to mediate between a dispute between two rival families, but John actually married the heiress of the Angoulême family, Isabella, who had been betrothed to the rival family. A rebellion broke out and John was ordered to appear in front of the French king, and when he did not do this, war broke out between England and France. But by 1206, King John had lost large amounts of French territory, including Normandy and Anjou. He was losing the war heavily, and he was determined to win his lands back. But this was cost, and his government raised taxes across England, and the king exploited his feudal rights over his population more, and the taxes went up heavily, and people were furious because of this. There was a lot of discontent within the barons, and negotiations between the king and his barons failed, and civil war broke out in the May of 1215. The rebels seized London, and John was forced to negotiate, and this concluded on the 19th of June at Runnymede on the River Thames, when John accepted the terms of the Magna Carta. This charter limited the royal power and ensured that feudal rights, and it was the first formal document stating that the king was under the rule of law, as was his people, and that the king was not above the law. King John claimed that this would be signed under duress, and the Pope took his side, and John in anger laid waste to the north and the Scottish borders with his army. Prince Louis of France was then to invade at the request of the barons, but John continued to wage war. In the September of 1216, he began a fresh attack, and he marched from the Cotswolds to relieve Windsor Castle, and he attacked many settlements. However, in Lynn, John contracted dysentery, and this would later become fatal. There were further invasions in England, and John, when he was heading west, lost much of his baggage train, and the king's belongings, including the crown jewels, were lost as John crossed one of the tidal estuaries into the Walsh, and it's claimed that these may have even been sucked in by quicksand. But this incident has never been confirmed. However, John was becoming very ill. He stopped to rest inside of the abbey in Swine's Head in the Lincolnshire Fens. However, he managed to make his way to Newark Castle, which was a short distance away. There was debate as to whether John was poisoned inside of the abbey by one of the monks or the abbot, who did not want to host the king. John ate the food and drank with the monks. However, inside of Newark Castle, it was clear to many that the king was very ill. John met his end inside of a toilet in Newark Castle in the October of 1216. He died from dysentery, which was a very terrible disease that causes serious diarrhoea and would then result in death. There were rumours that he was killed by eating too many unripe peaches, which poisoned him and made him sick, or that he drank too much ale. It was then claimed by a historian that to say John died of overindulgence was a way of criticising his personality. It implies impertinence, gluttony, and imprudence. To say he was poisoned showed he was hated. Whatever the truth, those writing down history had nothing to say about John. Dysentery is caused by parasites in the gut, and it's most commonly spread by consuming dirty water or food that have been contaminated with human waste. It was not necessarily a condition of the common people who lived in unsanitary conditions, as lots of food and vegetables had been grown in soil which was fertilised by human waste. John could have contracted this in a manner of ways, drinking contaminated water when he rampaged across the country. Following John's death, his body was embalmed by the abbot of Croxton Abbey in Leicestershire, and his internal organs were then buried there. Nothing remains of this site today. However, it's known that John's heart was placed in a gold vessel and buried elsewhere, and that his coffin was trapezodal stone coffin, and with a round head cavity, and that it was initially buried in the floor of the Lady Chapel of Worcester Cathedral. However, John's body was then disturbed, and it was moved to the high altar of the cathedral in 1232, and an effigy was carved out of the original coffin lid, and this was placed on top of the tomb. The tomb was then reburied as a table tomb in 1529. The body at this point was said to have been wrapped in gold and silver cloth and had different royal regalia. However, the coffin of King John may have been desecrated and disturbed during the English Civil War. It's known for certain that John's coffin was opened in the July of 1797, and that during this it was found, when the body was moved to begin with, the cranium of John had been turned a strange way, and that this caused damage. Both of the jaw bones had broken away, and they were found next to the right elbow, and also a leg bone had been stolen. But what was also found out was that the king's burial was very different to even other medieval kings and queens. Many medieval monarchs were buried with great pomp and ceremony, and were dressed in their state robes, signalling their importance. However, King John, when he was placed in the coffin, was buried wearing a simple monk's habit, which included a cowl, and this had been tied under his chin. This could have been for a number of reasons, from the fact it was the only clothes that the abbot who embalmed him had in his possession, or even that John requested this as he had been treated well by monks previously when he was fed, and that he may have also wanted to be buried in monk's robes to signal his piety and religious devotion. But this may have also been done by John to almost apologise to God for his actions, bringing civil war to his nation that resulted in the deaths of many. When the coffin of John was opened, it was said the monk's robes were preserved rather well, and that his skeleton had been preserved well by them. The investigators also stated that no flesh had been found on his body. However, it was said that there was a number of maggots found in the coffin, meaning that the preservation of John's body and the embalming had not been hugely successful, with these creatures feasting on the remains of the worst English king's corpse. King John was one of the worst kings ever to rule over England, but in his death his remains were buried a number of times, and his coffin was broken into. What those who opened the coffin found was the remains of a king who were buried almost in the same way that a high-ranking monk would be. It was not a royal burial, but one which was low-key for a man who many believed would never have been entitled to be buried alongside other monarchs inside of Westminster Abbey. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.